Naples, 1495. Soldiers are rotting alive. Not metaphorically, literally rotting. Pustules erupt across their skin, thick and raised and crusting over, some the size of acorns. Flesh falls from their faces in strips. Noses collapse inward, eaten from within, leaving dark cavities where cartilage used to be. Bones warp beneath the muscle. Joints swell until men cannot walk. Some go blind. Some go mad. Their minds consumed by a creeping insanity that their physicians have no name for. And within months, some simply stop breathing, their bodies so overtaken by lesions that there is nothing left for medicine to save. A German scholar named Joseph Grunpeck contracted the disease during those early years. He described it as the most cruel, most distressing, most appalling affliction ever known on Earth. And Grunpeck was not a man given to exaggeration. He was a humanist, a writer, a man of measured words. The disease broke his language the way it broke his body. Nobody in Europe has seen anything like this. Not the physicians, not the priests, not the battlefield surgeons who have pulled arrows from chests and cauterized wounds with hot iron. The remedies they try are worse than useless. Mercury, rubbed into the skin, heated into vapor, inhaled in sealed chambers until patients vomit and their gums bleed and their teeth fall out. Some survive the disease only to die from the cure. Others lose their noses to the mercury before the disease even gets the chance. A surgeon in Bologna named Gasparo Tagliacozzi will eventually develop a technique for rebuilding destroyed noses by grafting skin from the upper arm, essentially inventing one of the earliest forms of plastic surgery. That is how bad this is. The disease creates an entire field of reconstructive medicine just to deal with the damage it leaves behind. And before anyone even begins to understand what the disease is, before a single cause is identified, the blaming starts. The Italians call it the French disease. The French call it the disease of Naples. The English call it the French pox. The Germans call it the French evil. The Russians call it the Polish disease. The Poles call it the Turkish disease. The Turks call it the Christian disease. And across the Ottoman Empire, across India, across the parts of the world far enough away that the internal European squabbling blurs into one shape, they simply call it the European disease. Every single nation in the path of this epidemic looked at its nearest rival and said, "This came from you." And there was a reason the disease spread so fast. King Charles VIII of France had invaded Italy with an army of 50,000 men, but they were not all French. His forces were a patchwork of mercenaries, Flemish, Gascon, Swiss, Italian, Spanish, recruited from across Europe and bound together by nothing except money. Alongside the soldiers marched 800 camp followers, cooks, medical attendants, prostitutes. When Charles took Naples in February of 1495, his soldiers celebrated with weeks of unrestrained debauchery. And when the disease tore through the ranks so violently that the army could no longer fight, Charles retreated. His mercenaries scattered. They went home, to France, to Spain, to Germany, to Switzerland, to Flanders. And they carried the disease with them like seeds in the wind. Within 5 years, syphilis had reached every corner of Europe. By 1500, it had spread to Scandinavia, Hungary, Greece, Poland, Russia. Explorers took it to India by 1498. By 1520, it had reached Africa, China, Japan, and Oceania. An entire planet, infected within a single generation. Nobody said, "We don't know." Nobody said, "Let us investigate." The first instinct, the immediate instinct, was to pick a neighbor and attach their name to the horror. The disease became a weapon of language before it was ever understood as a pathogen. Even the word syphilis itself comes from a 1530 poem by an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro, who invented a fictional shepherd called Syphilis and wrote that the god Apollo cursed him with the disease as punishment for blasphemy. Even the name is a punishment story. Even the name says, "You brought this on yourself." And the version of history that eventually won, the one taught in schools and written into textbooks for centuries, said the disease came from across the Atlantic. that Christopher Columbus and his sailors brought it back in 1493, that the New World infected the Old, that the blame, ultimately, belonged to an entire hemisphere, one that never asked to be discovered, never asked to be colonized, and never had any say in how its diseases would be narrated by the people who invaded it. That story held for 500 years. It is wrong, and DNA just proved it. To understand why this matters, you need to know one thing about syphilis that almost nobody talks about. Syphilis is not one disease. It belongs to a family of diseases, all caused by nearly identical strains of the same bacterium, Treponema pallidum. Syphilis, yaws, Bagel, Pinta. 4 names, 4 conditions, 4 distinct patterns of illness. And genetically, the bacteria behind them are so similar that the difference between the one that causes syphilis and the one that causes yaws is less than 1% of their entire genetic code. Less than 1%. Which means that for centuries, when archaeologists found ancient bones with suspicious lesions, bones that looked like they might bear the marks of syphilis, they could never be certain. The scarring on the bone looks nearly identical across all 4 diseases. You cannot tell them apart with the naked eye. You cannot tell them apart under a microscope. You cannot tell them apart through any physical examination of the skeleton, no matter how sophisticated. The only way to know which disease carved those marks into someone's bones, to know with absolute certainty whether a skeleton was infected with syphilis or with one of its nearly identical cousins, is to extract the DNA of the bacterium itself from inside those bones. And that, for decades, was the problem. Treponema pallidum exists in vanishingly small amounts in infected bone. Pulling its genetic material from remains that are centuries old is extraordinarily difficult. Pulling it from remains that are thousands of years old was, for a long time, considered virtually impossible. So the debate froze. The Columbian camp pointed at the timing, the suspicious explosion of disease right after Columbus returned. The pre-Columbian camp pointed at European skeletons with treponema-like marks from before 1492. Both sides had evidence. Neither side had proof. 2 camps pointing at each other across an ocean of ambiguity and no molecular tool sharp enough to settle it. That is where things stood, for decades. An intellectual stalemate dressed up as a scholarly controversy. Careers were built on one side or the other. Conferences were organized around the debate. Entire books were written arguing positions that could never be proven without the one piece of evidence nobody could get, the DNA of the ancient pathogen itself. Then in 2024, a team in Leipzig broke through. Kirsten leads the molecular paleopathology group at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Her team, working in collaboration with archaeologists across Latin America, obtained bone samples from 5 ancient individuals buried in what is now Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and Chile. These were not colonial-era remains. These were not even medieval remains. Some of these bones were 9,000 years old. 9,000. That is older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the invention of writing. These people lived and died thousands of years before any European vessel ever touched American shores. And from those bones, from inside the scarred and damaged tissue, the team managed to do what nobody had done before. They extracted 5 complete ancient genomes of Treponema pallidum, the bacterium behind the syphilis disease family. 5 full genetic blueprints of a pathogen that had been sleeping in the ground for millennia. I want you to let that land. 9,000 years. The bacterium was already there, already diverse, already established across an entire hemisphere. Thousands of years before the first European ship, thousands of years before Columbus was a whisper of an idea. The family tree of this disease did not begin with contact. It did not begin with colonization. It began in the deep, deep past of the Americas, in a time when Europe did not know these continents existed and would not know for thousands of years to come. And here is the part that rearranges everything you thought you knew. When the researchers placed those 5 ancient genomes onto the evolutionary tree alongside all the modern strains circulating today, the ancient ones did not sit in one small corner. They did not cluster in a single branch. They fanned out. They were sister lineages to all the modern forms: syphilis, yaws, Bagel. Every known version of this disease family had an ancient American root. The Americas were not a waypoint, not a pit stop, not one source among many. They were the origin, the trunk of the tree. Everything that circulates on every other continent today, every strain of syphilis in every modern hospital database on Earth, branched off from what was already living in the Americas when the rest of the world had not even heard the word. Now, let me be fair, because bones have been found in Europe with treponemal-looking damage that appears to predate 1492. Skeptics of the Columbian Hypothesis have pointed to these for years. Remains from Finland, Estonia, the Netherlands, England, marks on the skeleton that look like they could be syphilis. And for a while, those bones looked like strong counter-evidence. But here is what the DNA actually showed. When researchers managed to extract pathogen genomes from some of those European remains, the bacteria inside were not syphilis. They were other members of the Treponema family. Related diseases, cousins, not the same organism. The bones were real. The damage was real. But the diagnosis that had been assumed for decades, that had been cited in hundreds of papers and repeated in thousands of lectures, was wrong. Europe had treponemal disease before Columbus. That part appears to be true. But it did not have syphilis. What exploded across the continent in 1495, what sent soldiers into madness and ate the noses off the faces of cardinals and mercenaries alike, was something new arriving on European soil, not something that had been lurking in European bones all along. I keep coming back to the naming, because it tells you something about human beings that the science alone never could. The first thing Europe did when the pustules appeared was not to ask what was happening. It was to ask who to blame. The French blamed Naples because the disease first appeared during the siege of Naples. The Neapolitans blamed France because it arrived with French soldiers. The Dutch blamed Spain because they were fighting a war against Spain. The Poles blamed the Turks. The Turks blamed Christendom. The Persians, in a rare act of self-scrutiny, called it Persian fire. Even the pattern continued with condoms. In England, condoms were called French letters. In France, they were called English overcoats. 5 centuries later, the reflex had not changed. When you cannot face the thing itself, you name it after someone you already distrust. And the stakes of that naming were not abstract. The naming carried weight. Real, material, life-altering weight. From the moment the disease appeared, syphilis was understood as a moral affliction. Not a medical one, a moral one. Kings and emperors issued edicts declaring it punishment for sin. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I called it a consequence of blasphemy. Woodcuts from the 1490s, some attributed to Albrecht Dürer himself, show sufferers being struck by divine spears, their bodies covered in sores, the heavens raining down arrows of judgment. One image shows the infant Christ himself hurling light spears at the diseased, as though God had dispatched a baby to punish the unclean. The infected were not treated as patients. They were treated as sinners. Lepers were cast out. Syphilitics were shunned. And the desperation to escape that label was so intense that it drove the birth of cosmetic surgery, the grafting of new noses onto faces destroyed by the disease and by the toxic mercury used to treat it. Imagine a world where the mark of your illness was visible on your face, where your collapsed nose announced to every stranger that you had sinned, and where the only escape was a surgeon cutting skin from your arm and stitching it onto the ruin. The question of where the disease originated was never really a question about geography. It was a question about who deserved to carry the shame. And for 5 centuries, the Americas carried it. If you have been with this channel for a while, you know that DNA has a habit of doing this, of quietly dismantling stories that entire civilizations built to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths. Stories about who belongs where, about who brought what, about who is clean and who is contaminated. The genome does not care about national borders. It does not care about blame. It does not care about the careful fictions that empires construct to explain their own suffering. It just tells you what happened. And what happened here is this. A family of bacteria lived in the Americas for at least 9,000 years. They caused illness. The people who carried them lived alongside those pathogens, developed immune responses over generations, adapted. The disease was part of the biological landscape, present but managed, endemic but not catastrophic. When Europeans arrived, they encountered these organisms for the very first time. They had no immunity, no biological preparation. And when the bacterium crossed the Atlantic, carried in the bodies of sailors or soldiers or enslaved people forced onto ships, it found an entire continent of immunologically naive hosts. And it exploded. That explosion was not the fault of the Americas. It was not a gift sent from one world to punish another. It was the consequence of contact, of ships crossing an ocean that had kept two biological ecosystems apart for thousands of years. The disease did not choose to travel. It was carried. And the ones who carried it across the water were not indigenous Americans sailing east. They were European colonizers sailing west. And the exchange was not equal, not even close. In return for syphilis, Europe sent smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases that would kill an estimated 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas within a century of contact. Entire civilizations erased, languages lost, lineages extinguished. If we are keeping a ledger of biological harm between continents, the balance sheet is not ambiguous. It is one of the most lopsided exchanges in the history of the human species. And yet, for 500 years, it was the Americas that bore the blame for a single disease, while Europe's biological assault on an entire hemisphere was narrated as the inevitable cost of progress. There is something else the DNA revealed that I think gets far too little attention. The ancient strains found in the Americas, the ones dating back thousands of years, show signs that the disease may not even have been sexually transmitted in its original context. In the Americas, these bacteria likely spread through ordinary skin-to-skin contact, the way yaws still spreads today. No stigma attached, no shame, no morality tale, just an infection, part of life, like a cold or a rash, managed and lived with. It was only in Europe that the disease became venereal. Only in Europe that it became associated with sex, with sin, with moral corruption. The bacterium adapted to a new mode of transmission in a new environment, one where different social structures, different hygiene patterns, and different population densities favored sexual spread over casual contact. And with that adaptation came 5 centuries of stigma that was never, ever part of the disease's original story. Think about what that means for a moment. The shame was never in the pathogen. It was never in the biology. The shame was manufactured, built from scratch by a culture that encountered something it did not understand and, instead of studying it, judged it, named it after enemies, called it divine wrath, blamed a continent that had been living with the organism for 9,000 years without ever attaching a single syllable of moral weight to its existence. The disease did not arrive with shame. The shame was added at the European border. Syphilis is still with us. 8 million new infections every year across the globe. It is curable now, easily, a simple course of antibiotics. Penicillin has worked against it since 1943. And yet, the stigma has not fully disappeared. The whispered tone when someone mentions the diagnosis, the reluctance to get tested, the echo of centuries of moral judgment still clinging to a bacterium that does not know what morality is. And the origin story, The one that blamed the Americas, the one that framed indigenous peoples as the source of European suffering. That story persisted in medical textbooks and history classrooms well into the 21st century. It was not until 2024 that the molecular evidence became strong enough to say, with confidence, that the family tree of syphilis has its deepest roots in the Americas, and that Europe was the newcomer to a pathogen that had been evolving quietly for millennia before anyone in Paris or London or Rome had ever heard of it. DNA does not write history. People write history. DNA just makes it harder to lie. There is a bone in a laboratory in Leipzig right now. It belonged to someone who lived in what is now Peru more than 2,000 years ago. We do not know their name. We do not know their face. We know they had a treponemal infection because the marks are visible on the bone. They lived with it. They were buried by people who knew them, who mourned them, who placed them in the earth with whatever care their community offered its dead. And that skeleton lay in the ground, undisturbed, for 2 millennia. When scientists finally opened that bone and pulled out the bacterial DNA trapped inside, it told a story that 500 years of human accusation could not bury. The disease was already there, deep in the soil of a continent that had never heard of Europe, older than Rome, older than Athens, older than the alphabet, older than the idea that disease could be someone else's fault. And every name that Europe gave this illness, the French disease, the Neapolitan disease, the Polish disease, the Turkish disease, the Christian disease, the American disease, every single one of them was wrong. Not because the names were imprecise, but because naming a disease after your enemy was never really about the disease at all. It was about fear. It was about disgust. It was about the desperate human need to believe that the terrible thing came from somewhere else, that it was brought by someone else, that if you could just identify the right outsider to blame, the horror would make sense. It never made sense. It was just a bacterium, and it was already 9,000 years old when Europe first screamed. Syphilis did not come from France. It did not come from Naples. It did not come from the Turks or the Poles or the Christians or the Americas. It came from the deep past, from a microbe that had been quietly evolving in the soils and the skins and the bones of the Western Hemisphere for longer than most civilizations have existed. And when it finally crossed the ocean, it did not arrive as an accusation. It arrived as a consequence of a world that had just been torn open by ships and greed, and the assumption that everything on the other side of the water was there for the taking. Today, there are still 8 million people who contract syphilis every year. The disease is treatable. The blame is not. And somewhere in a clean room in Leipzig, a 2,000-year-old bone still holds a genome that answers a question 500 years of finger-pointing never could. What changes, do you think, if we stop asking who gave this to us and start asking what did we do when we found it?